Thank you for coming. As you all know, this is a conversation on compassion. It's really a joy and a pleasure to host this conversation with Kyra. Her and I have been friends for quite some time, and she's really quite an incredible individual. She did her medical training at UCSF and then later got a master's at Harvard, and then has really I think along her path, been engaged in trying to understand behavior, what drives behavior, what changes behavior. And now she's here at Stanford and has created a, if you will, a company to design your life, which I think is the name of the book that she has out there. And she's created a company called engagedIN. And really, that's going to be the topic of our conversation in part because what we do at CCARE, of which I'm the director, and for those of you who may not know, is the Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education. Our mission is to understand how behaviors such as compassion and altruism impact individuals in regard to health, wellness, and longevity. We know now that there's an immense amount of science that when one acts with compassionate intention, it has a huge and significant impact on these areas. And really, in spending a fair amount of time with Kyra, the reality is that when you're looking to, if you will, design your life, the underpinnings of that are compassion and really a great deal of compassion for yourself, because so many of us beat ourselves up every day, either not living up to what we wish to be or failing once, twice. And the reality is that there's neuroscience behind why that happens, but there's now also neuroscience how to overcome that and become the person you really wish to be. And that's really what our conversation is going to be about tonight, if that's okay. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, let's get to your book, and I just want to show this so that Well-Designed Life, so for those of you who might be interested in getting it. You know, I've read the book, and it's interesting because people send me a lot of books, and invariably they're about compassion or happiness. But unfortunately, I can't read them all because there's so many of them. And then I get emails from these people which make me feel like I'm not being compassionate because I haven't read them all. But this book I have read and thoroughly enjoyed, and actually enjoyed to the point where I found it quite useful for some of the things I'm trying to do. But I found it interesting in that you gave an example of how people, if you will, give up, and use the example of the elephant, and maybe you can...
So one of the big ahas that I had in working to change people's behavior, that's our profession. And one of the things that I was doing research on, because I like to read about neuroscience. I don't know as much as you do, Dr. Doty, but I like to read about the brain constantly. And I started coming across this body of research on an area of the brain called the habenula. And because it was this motivation project that we were dealing with. And what we found was that the habenula, recent discoveries about the habenula, is that if you try something and you fail, the habenula basically downregulates your motivation to try that thing again, which I found completely fascinating. We see this on the physical level as people yo-yo dieting and giving up and those kinds of things, but I never understood that there was actually a purpose for it, which is, you don't want to touch the stove and be like, ow, ow, ow. You want to stop, right? So if something's not working for you, it's, favorable that you don't try that again. But when it comes to lifestyle change or improving yourself or those kinds of things, it actually works against you. And so people who are successful are able to reframe around the habenula, whether they know it or not, and avoid triggering off that perception that I failed. And in the book, I talk about, elephants being this perfect metaphor for this. Elephants in India who are staked to the ground, as domestic animals or domesticated elephants, and that's done when they're this big and when they're tiny, and then when they grow up, they're of course more powerful. They could rip that thing out of the ground in 1 second, but their habenula has been trained that they can't do that. So their conditioning, for those of you who work with that word, has really taken the better of them. And I think that's really the essence of what I see as the sort of survivors of behavior change versus those that get caught up in how the brain works.
So maybe that takes us to sort of the next part of this, which is how do we stop being the elephant? That could be literally or figuratively.
Yeah, I think for me, I like to study things in terms of people who successfully make it through the course, the obstacle course versus those that get caught up with the obstacles. And I would say far and away, the consistent pattern that I see is a mindset of iteration, which is what brought me to design. I think design is the perfect metaphor or reframe or focus point. In Buddhist practice or in Eastern philosophies, there's this idea of practice, or in yoga, my practice. That's kind of the same, synonym in that it gives you a reason that it's not done and over. Contrast that to the Western society, which is very, goal-oriented, and that's a win-lose game, especially things like SMART goals. Who knows about SMART goals? Anyone heard about that? Yeah, so that's this sort of super tight, super narrow, super defined, which is great when you're trying to go for something that might be hard. You want to make sure it's concise enough and it's not vague, But where it runs against us is that if we choose something as an outcome goal that is really a process, then we have the wrong frame that we're working with.
Well, I think this is where people have great difficulty, right? Because unlike the iterative process, in fact, in some ways it's like the evolutionary process, right? You make incremental improvements that take you a little bit down. But I think, and I see this even in myself, believe it or not, that, you set a goal sometimes, and again, you say, this is a goal, I have to do X, Y, or Z, and it's a significant goal that's far away. And as a result, instead of iterating it to just make these little improvements, you can do nothing else but look at that goal. And if you deviate, then you failed. And this is where this habenula issue comes up.
Yeah, it becomes the rubric by which you judge your own failure. Yeah. And then you short out. So then you stop. And so I'm simply trying to offer a way out of stop, a way out of failure, an alternative pathway, which, of course, the second chapter that I started with was compassion. And citing your work because and this is the tribe of compassion. You guys would not have taken the time out of your busy lives to show up in physical form somewhere that you didn't care deeply about the topic. So, you're on the right track. That is absolutely the foundation of all behavior change is compassion.
And I think it's interesting because you also talk about empathy. And while I may know this, some of the audience, especially how you frame it here, in the context of this iterative process and reaching these goals, or if you will, designing your life, maybe you can contrast those and how you see that. Yeah,
so, very wonderful. At Stanford, we're lucky to have one of the premier design schools on the planet. Right? The D School, which is wonderful, has produced a lot of great things. They have as their cornerstone empathy as a first step. When you're designing for someone, you want to empathize with their experience, which is better than what we do in healthcare, which is just ignore their experience, right? Not entirely. I don't mean that, but a lot. It's an Achilles heel of being able to innovate in healthcare. So, I ran across Richie Davidson's study of healthcare workers or people. It was people, and then they applied it later, who were trained in empathy and then trained in compassion. And they ran them side by side, and they showed them disturbing images. And the people who had been trained in empathy only had really bad reactions and could no longer look at the traumatic images. But people who were trained in compassion also, and even the empathy group that was then later trained in compassion, had this sustenance, this endurance of being able to be in the presence of suffering and not shrink back, which I found super fascinating. Because I used to work with, and I'm still on the board of an organization that serves incarcerated youth who are, violent, serious, chronic violent offenders. And I, became very affected because I was empathizing with them. And I had to take a back seat to the direct service. And just now I feel comfortable going back into the halls, because I got burnt out. My empathy, was a burnout track. And that's what Davidson says about it, is that empathy burns you out, but compassion is kind of the green energy that keeps going sustainably.
Well, some people do use compassion fatigue because I think the distinction you're trying to make is important. In fact, Mathieu Ricard, who was involved in a number of these studies, and many of you may probably know him, he's a Buddhist monk, and he's been given the title, I think, by the press of the happiest man alive. But he probably has done over 30,000 hours of compassion training, meditation. But interestingly, he can regulate his empathic response. By percentage. And if you put him under an fMR and we look at the areas that are associated in the brain with an empathic response, and empathy being the taking on of the emotional state of another, you could ask him to go 25%, and he can actually regulate 1/4 of his maximal compassion or empathy. And then you can ask, 50%, and you'll just see this increase in blood flow to those regions of the brain. And it's really quite extraordinary that his degree of ability to control his mind. But what he says is that once he starts getting over that, it becomes extraordinarily painful, because if you are taking on the emotional state of another person who is suffering, you are living that suffering. And in fact, he starts tearing up and feeling actually pain. So the release is actually being compassionate, where you take on the suffering, but then in your mind, you have this incredible intention to embrace those people and alleviate that suffering, and that frees you from that. And
there was 2 different areas of the brain that lit up, for those various respective functions as well, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So let's say you're there, and because this gets back, though, in some ways, self-compassion is hard for people in terms of sort of this empathic response. They keep feeling this pain. And in fact, obviously, we're all generating that. What advice do you give to people then to get over that, in terms of being able to then be with the reality that we are not perfect human beings, and to go forward with that?
Well, I think, having the mindset of iteration helps you to realize that you're not bad. I mentioned the youth. One of the things that they taught me as a recipe of being willing to try again when you've hit bottom or you've done something bad, is, you have to have 3 elements. One is you're not bad. You have to have some story that you believe that is authentic to you, that reverses that feeling of I'm bad or I'm going to hell or whatever the storyline is. Number 2 is you're not alone. Other people have done this. Other people have been there before. And, and then the third one is there's a way out. Sometimes for people that's a move to a different city. Sometimes that's a change of a relationship, change of job, some epiphany that they have, taking a retreat and, unplugging from the world, all these different kind of ways. But I've noticed over and over again that unless people have all 3 of those kind of checked off, that they get sort of overwhelmed by their own self-loathing and their own shame, for what they've done or what they think they've done.
Well, I think one of the challenges in modern society is that if you look at generations ago, where people grew up in the same village and, they live with their parents, the grandparents, their children, and they've lived there their entire lives, they're sort of in this constant nurturing, caring environment. And as a result, these people know who you are, everything about you, the good parts, the bad parts, yet they still love you. And having that connectivity, that type of nurturing, that type of caring is hugely impactful in one's ability not to beat themselves up so much, because they can be out there as who they are and recognize that people still love them and accept them. In modern society, we don't have that. And as an example, as you know, I'm sure that 1/4 of people in the United States, when they say they're suffering or in pain, have no one, not a single person they feel they can comfortably talk to. Can you imagine that? And I'm sure there's probably people in this room. And so what happens is they don't have that connection, that support system. And, I can even say for myself in some instances, being the macho guy that I am, I know none of you have ever seen me cry at a talk. But, you feel like I have to go it alone, especially if this is a practice that you've grown up with and and you've gotten away with, and it's allowed you to survive because you haven't had a support system. But the reality is that I think the greatest gift you can give to yourself is to let others help you. And I think that's so hard for so many people.
Well, and my epiphany when I got to UCSF was, here's 140 high-performing individuals, best in the world kind of, group. And how...
I thought Stanford.
No, well, one of the best in the world. But anybody who reaches a Stanford, a UCSF, or those kinds of, has, my epiphany was, wait a minute, what we all have in common is that we've all flogged ourselves to do things that we otherwise wouldn't do. What is the story? What is the way that you get yourself to do things that you otherwise don't want to do, or that are too hard to do, or those kinds of things? So everybody kind of used that, really heavy smog-like, high emissions fuel to get from here to there. And there's no sense of, there's a cleaner burning fuel of success, that we could use instead, which is the compassion, is the self-love.
Well, let's talk about another aspect of this, which is this idea, and I think you explain it quite wonderfully, this idea of the slow brain, fast brain, and what that means in the context of sort of trying to become the people we want to be, or creating habits, and how one affects the other. Right.
So this was, and this happened in the youth also, when they were locked up, they would say, I don't want to do this again. I don't want to come back here again. I don't want to. And at that time, I think I was mostly believing them, but somewhat slightly judgmental that, well, if you know better, why don't you do better, right?
Maybe you can explain to some of the people the exact work you were doing, because I don't think I actually covered that, so they understand.
Okay, yeah, exactly. So when I was at UCSF, there was a program volunteering in the Juvenile Hall of San Francisco in this unit that was full of young men who had done repeated crimes of a violent nature. And then they went on to Log Cabin Ranch, and myself and a couple other medical students started a program that started out as medical education, but then migrated towards personal development and life skills and inner awareness ultimately. And so we would have deep conversations with them about behavior change and their intentions and what was holding them back and things like that. And of course, I was studying all kinds of Western psychology models and things like that I was trying to get my mind around what was going on, And so, I saw this pattern, but I didn't really articulate it between what they wanted to do and what they actually did when they got out of jail. Because once they hit the streets, it was like everything went back in place. Their friends came and got them. They ignored my phone calls. I would knock on their doors and they would pretend not to be home. It was humiliating. And there I am down in the projects, like this. So, I noticed it then. And then later on, flash forward, I went to Harvard and I was running a clinical study for a very large company, in collaboration with Duke. And one of my participants in my study was this woman who was doing, kind of a weight loss behavior change kind of program. And I interviewed her as part of the study, and she said, well, I'm learning so much, and I'm learning how to eat, and I'm learning how to do better things for myself. And then she stops and she's like, but I know what I should do. I don't know why I don't do it. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. You know, those things that people say that change your life entirely.
Has anyone had that experience?
Yeah, and so I reflected also. I was like, well, that's no different from what I'm experiencing. And so, you know, going through all of the neuroscience, all the behavior science, you know, there's this notion in behavior psychology of system 1 and system 2 thinking. Have you guys read Thinking Fast and Slow, Kahneman? Thick read, but yeah. And so, you know, that was too complex for me. So I just shortcutted it to fast brain, slow brain. And it's a really good way of understanding, you know, with your slow brain, that's where you plan things. That's where you set goals. That's where you set intentions. And then lo and behold, your fast brain, which runs about 90 to 95% of your behaviors, throws the cookie in your mouth before your slow brain's like, wait, you know. So it's this whole, you know, chase and way of closing that gap. And, you know, for example, my best friend who has this chronic problem of dating her father in different forms of men that she repeats. She was frustrated the other day, and we were talking about this because this is years. She went to therapy years ago. She realized, okay, red flag is if it feels familiar, run the other way, right? And we were talking about it, and she said, well, you know, I just was dating this guy, and within 3 days I realized, oh, there's Larry again. And, you know, she's like, I don't want to see him again. And he was confused as to why she was breaking it off, but she's like, you know, I just don't think we should continue. And I said, look, you're making progress. She goes, why? I'm still picking the same guy. How can I not pick the same guy? I said, no, but you know, it used to take you longer to recognize that you were dating Larry. And now you're down to 3 days, you know, so you're almost, your slow brain's catching up to your fast brain. And you're almost to that point where you can actually do something about it, prospectively. So,
well, I think that is a really hard thing, and you know, you point out because, as an example, what I do is I end up operating in the middle of the night, and of course, when I finish, I'm usually really hungry, right? Mm-hmm. And you know, if you wake up in the morning, as you point out, it's easy to be, well, I'm not going to do this today, and I'm not going to do that today. At night, when you're really hungry and you're really, really tired, mm-hmm. that's when the fast brain kicks in, yep. and you go get that super taco with Jack in the Box.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Autopilot.
Exactly.
That's right.
And then afterwards, you're going, why did I do that? I didn't even, you know. So it's
yeah, and it's almost this experience of like, no, you know, like it's happening, but it's just kind of coming in for a landing anyway.
Exactly. I really want that super taco.
That's priming.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, exactly.
See, I'm just giving you examples so we can talk about it.
That's right.
Talk a little bit about sort of past self, future self.
Oh, yeah.
And how to maybe integrate that
That's
into sort of the aspiration you wish to be.
Right. And this is related to compassion very strongly, which is that, you know, the way we come to look at behavior change is the past self, the designer, is designing for the future self, which is the one who has to carry out all these fun plans. So people who set New Year's resolutions where they get up at 5 a.m. in the freezing cold and, you know, go jogging, for example, their past self is being a jerk, or stronger words, towards their future self. You know, like if that was your friend, they would hate you, right? So we've come to realize that, you know, part of compassionate design is figuring out, you know, what would that person like to do? And if I'm wrong, you know, if I give them a gift they don't want, i.e., you know, a treadmill that they'll never use, what can I do differently to close that gap, to be a good gift giver, to be a good designer for that person? You know, and embrace, and also hold boundaries or anticipate where they might make a run for it or where they might rebel, and give them some way to recover compassionately as well. Because everything that I designed for my future self will at one point deteriorate. You know, I had this cleanse a year and a half ago that I started. And at first I was super psyched, you know, I was going to do it every quarter. My husband joined me and we did 3 weeks. It was hardcore restricted food eating kind of stuff. It's almost like a diet, and it was a cleanse diet. And then second quarter came along. I was still into it, but towards the end, I kind of started to cheat, which in my world as a designer means that the design is breaking. It's, the future self is not on board 100% anymore. So then I pay attention to those hypocrisy and inconsistency are my friends, because they're little symptoms that something's starting to fray, something's starting to come apart, and I have to iterate. That's my signal to iterate. So about 2 or 3 months ago, because I became so non-adherent with my past plan, I iterated to 1 week at the beginning of each month. And so that's what I'm on right now. So unless we have that relationship, we focus on it like a relationship, like a good friend or a partner, and really treat our future self with that level of love and respect.
Well, it's interesting because, as an example, the one you just gave, I mean, the 3 weeks is pretty hardcore.
Right.
And when it shows up again, that's really hardcore.
Right.
And it's like making these, one that's really, really hard to stick to right from the start.
That's right. And we're kind of animals, because I have this dog that she has, anything damaging happens to her and she remembers it forever. So we gave her a bath one time because she challenged a skunk in the backyard. And that shower at the end of our bedroom is way over there. But if I call her and I'm like, hey, come on, Tawny, she'll go as far as the threshold of the bathroom and she will go no farther, because she still remembers that shower, that involuntary shower from when she was a puppy. And this is 7 years later. So, I think, our future self can also become scarred by our austere 21-day fast or whatever we do to ourselves.
Interesting.
Yeah.
One of the things is you talked about emotion and motivation. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can sort of share that.
Yeah. So this was the hardest chapter to write, because I had done a lot of research on motivation and also on emotion. And I knew they were key in decision making and action, following through. But I also knew that a lot of the models that we use right now aren't very useful from a design perspective. And so in looking at them, I created a 2x2 table where I realized that all that matters for design and for behavior change to happen is whether motivation is stable or unstable. And all that happens, or all that matters in changing behavior also for emotion, is whether it's strong or weak. And once you know those two things, you can create this grid and start to sort out your behaviors as to how much power they have with the combination of motivation and emotion. And then as a designer, all you have to do is amp up the power. Try to crawl up the ladder, if you will, of that 2x2 until you can go as high as you can go. Most things in healthcare and wellness and well-being and behavior change, to make ourselves healthier, sit in what we call quadrant 4, which is, unstable motivation, which is that kind of flakiness, like, I think I'll do this. I think I'll organize my closet. And low levels of emotion, which are kind of fleeting. They're not the sort of epiphanies or significant emotional events. So using that tool, I hope you find it helpful. It really makes you more clear and better at making whatever plans you want to make for yourself.
So in terms of that grid, mm-hmm. Do you think it's, creating that emotional attachment is the strongest ultimate motivator, or?
Yeah, no, I think that there's, again, the second most powerful quadrant is low emotion, high motivation, or stable motivation. So brushing teeth is an example. Any routine or habit. That's why there's a lot of work around habit design and habits these days that people are focused on. It's that quadrant 2 where my motivation is always on. It's not wavering. And my emotion is kind of at rest. I don't have to burn emotion in order to resist the taco or those kinds of things. Brushing teeth might be one, showering might be one, things that are routinized. It's the whole fast brain set. If you can get something into your autopilot center, where it flies under the radar and it's just me, then you're good to go. It'll hum like that for a very long time.
But, I think, well, at least for me, and the challenge is, though, how do you get there so that it's there, right?
Yeah.
And you talk about this period of time to ingrain these. Mm-hmm. So maybe you could sort of talk about
Yeah,
that?
the neuroplasticity thing. Yeah. So, one of the things we started mapping in our work was how long does it take to really establish a fully grown habit, a fully, adult-sized habit, and from a neural network perspective. And what we figured out was that most studies time it about a year or more. And yet the entire industry is looking at, 21-day diet or, 2 months to this or 30 days to your fabulous yourself and things like that. And the harm of that is that it sets the habenula to if 21 days not fixed, then failure, right? And so I think moving that target out, and I actually had somebody tell me when I was talking about the book, he was this guy in the literary field, and he said, "So what's the good news?" I said, "Well, the good news is that, instead of thinking 21 days, you can think a year." And he's like, "Well, that's not good news. I want to know that I'm done in 2 weeks." And I'm like, well, yeah, you want to know that, but you don't really want to know that. You want to know how long it really takes so that you can just keep going. You don't want to know a marathon is 400 yards and then have, 20 miles, 26 miles to go. You want to be able to calibrate your energy for how long it really takes. And then you have two neural networks that are equal size, that are equal strength, that can really compete. And then you'll see hypocrisy because they'll compete against each other for your time and attention. And some days you'll do the right thing. Some days you'll do the old thing, and that's how it goes. It's just this teeter-totter.
So what do you think, as people are sort of sitting here, if you were to make a goal, what would be the first thing that one would do to manifest that?
I think there's nothing wrong with setting like a very clear goal, but I think that where people stop is there. They need to figure out, okay, so then if this doesn't work, or if I start, like with my cleanse, if I start to see myself cheat or rebel or not follow through, then iterate. Then I'll take the time. That's a signal that there's some coverage that's not being covered there. It's like when you have an infection and you have an antibiotic that's not covering a certain bug, you've got to add another one. It's that kind of, you need to have coverage for all the different ways that you will wriggle out of the situation. We're very clever and we will figure a way out. And so you're almost like blocking the exits of your own, habitual behavior.
Who was it you gave the example who tied himself to the mast?
Oh, yeah, the Ulysses contract.
Yes, yeah.
I mean,
that's
right.
a pretty extreme way to do it, right?
That's right.
So you don't heed the siren's call. And, the reality is, many of us, that's a hard thing to do. But
it is. But, if you start, what I find is once people start thinking like this, it's a mindset. And then they start realizing, oh, if I leave carbs out on the counter, guess what? I'm going to lose at some point. So I'm going to put them in the back or out of reach or in the freezer, or I'm going to throw them away. And just even that algorithm, having that as your algorithm, is tremendously helpful, and even I was talking to my stepmother tonight, and she's working, she was inspired by the story of the woman with the baking, and she's been iterating on her muffins and things like that to make them smaller and those kinds of things. So it's really designing for a future self where, in Ulysses tied himself to the mast, his future self to the mast, so he couldn't do anything. We have to think mindset, like what would keep her from doing that thing that I don't want her to do anymore?
It's funny you mentioned the baking. My wife makes these wonderful pastries. And so she's been iterating to decrease the sugar and everything. And she's decreased it so much, I hate eating them. Because, yeah, exactly. So
That's right. That's right. I also find that when people take on this mindset, they feel in control. I like the shift of being completely out of control and how awful that feels. We all have had that experience. Like, I can't control myself. And that's such a form of suffering. And when people start to become of a designer mindset around their own behavior, they befriend themselves, and they also are in a position of personal power, which I really like.
No, I think that's probably really the most important thing, because I think when you fail, you start beating yourself up. Mm-hmm. And then not only, you say, I don't give a damn, and you then go off and go the extreme opposite of where you want it to be. but this idea of iteration and some of these ideas.
Right.
The challenge, though, is, and this is, I think, the big challenge is we know that if we were able to change our habits, that probably we could get rid of 80% of the pharmaceuticals, right?
Yeah, we could.
And avoid a large percentage of disease. I mean, we know, based on the work of a variety of people, including Dean Ornish and others, that you can get rid of heart disease, right? That most heart disease is avoidable or reversible.
Yeah, yeah.
And the same with diabetes. And in fact, until the 20s, within the American Indian population, there was never a reported case of diabetes. Okay. And in fact, most cases are entirely reversible or preventable by the things. Yet, all of these things which have profound effects, we continue to have challenges with.
Right.
And so do you see the obviously there's some really great things in here that will allow us to tweak this and to do and I love this idea of this iteration. But let's talk about relapse and hope.
Yeah.
And
that's right. So, relapse is something that we don't design for. I when I was writing that chapter, I realized there's not a single program or methodology or theory that I've come across professionally where it shows you how to come back from relapse. And I'm not talking about, Alcoholics Anonymous or those kinds of models where it's, socially buffered and there's a lot of mantras about how to get back on the plan, get back on the wagon. But we really don't design for it, meaning that we don't expect it. We're still bracing against it happening. Instead, it is absolutely going to happen. It is absolutely going to happen. And we're always like, oh, big surprise, And so I want to take away that surprise. I want to take away, oh, what do we do now? Well, we knew this would happen. This is normal, natural, and necessary for the change process. Change has never happened without this. So let's make sure that we can shorten it, that we can take away the shame, we can de-shame it, and that we can have a way to kind of continue to crank and get back going in emotion, because it's when people get stuck, they freeze or they get disappointed or they become despondent and they just stop, they give up.
Well, I think, again, this emphasizes, though, and I don't mean this to be about dieting or anything else. These are about just habits in general.
Yeah, no.
But, we see, though, the most successful programs always have to do with community in some ways, right? Yeah. And being with others who act as a support system. And I think it goes back to, what we talked about a little earlier as far as the manner in which we are designed is for community support and actually to be unconditionally loved. And when you're unconditionally loved, it releases shame, right? And it's the shame where you, I think, wish to hide from everyone that you are not who you project yourself to be to them, right? Versus people accepting you for all those good and bad parts.
Yeah, I'm also really intrigued by this idea in Buddhism in particular around fierce compassion, because that's kind of a truth saying with compassion on board. I know that you don't want to live like this. And that was really important in the work with prisoners because I couldn't just say, you're unconditionally loved however you're doing. So if you hit that elderly woman, you're fine. There has to, but on the other side, I don't want to judge them and say you're a bad person. So there's this kind of razor's edge of there's hope for you. There's hope for you. You're getting better. And I like how you did this one thing. And one person pointed out to me, even the worst criminal in the world does, way more good decisions than they do bad decisions. There's a couple bad decisions which are lethal, which are very damaging, which cause a lot of suffering. But, these are guys that if they had $1 in their pocket would give it to a homeless person. The level of generosity per capita or per the amount they have was so much higher than any other population I ever knew.
Well, and you know why that is, of course, because they've suffered deeply.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Because, when you're truly able to put yourself in that other person's position who's in great need, and unfortunately people in that environment run across people who are in great need all the time because it's a horrible place to be. And they know what it's like to be on the other side. And that's where generosity comes in. And it's interesting because, and this is a challenge even, here in Silicon Valley, you meet people, and studies have shown that if you are in a particular spectrum of society, which is in the upper socioeconomic area, what happens is you don't need anybody, do you? Because all your needs are met. You can get whatever you want, whenever you want it. You don't have to negotiate. You just either take it or buy it. And what happens to many of these people is their ability to read emotional states, which are so important for most of us to survive, really gets diminished. And so they can look at you and they don't really care your emotional state. They don't need you. And in life, many of the actions we do, and also one of the great rewards is because it's sort of quid pro quo oftentimes, where you help somebody, they're going to be there to help you. But, if you never have that, you don't have to have this sensitivity to the fact that somebody else is suffering. And it's really horribly unfortunate, because I think the greatest gift we get is not only caring for others, but being able to receive care and support and nurturing. And again, this is another problem in Western society, is actually being able to receive care and to being able to accept love. And Paul Gilbert talks about this in his own work, this fear of accepting compassion. And it's really a challenge. Do any of you guys ever experience that you're so bad that you don't deserve to be cared or loved? Any hands here? Come on, you guys can do it. We're all family here.
Right.
So let's talk. We're seeing a lot of changes in the healthcare system. I'm sure you'll agree that our healthcare system is profoundly broken. We have a healthcare system that treats illness. It doesn't promote wellness.
Right. And it creates isolation. I mean, I think, as you were talking, what I'm really into right now is the thing we have to fix in the healthcare system is any place where people become objects. Because as soon as you cross over that threshold, we can feel it. When somebody objectifies you, you're just a body, you're just a number, you're just this thing, and they have to move from here to there, or they have to cut open, or they have to cure, or whatever, or they have to see. We feel that, and it's very chilling, and it creates loneliness. And even, my daughters are college and high school age, and, I think there's a tremendous epidemic of, I'll call it oxytocin deficiency syndrome, where, there's dopamine, which these, Snapchats and all that kind of stuff are like just, it's a whir of dopamine, but the oxytocin, the feeling of connection, that you get from being compassionate, having compassionate acts, or having compassion bestowed upon you. We have this epidemic of loneliness kind of rising. And what I noticed when working with the young people is that they were lonely, they were isolated, and then on the flip side of that bell curve, the people who had the most wealth were also very isolated and very lonely. And so I think in healthcare, patients are lonely, patients are isolated, they're treated like objects. The clinicians are treated like objects back by just seeing them as a transactional, script writer, or those kinds of things. It's anywhere where we stop humanizing one another and stop recognizing the miracle and the beauty before us of the person that we are interacting with. And I think that, whether it's an app, whether it's a technology, we work on technologies and how they talk to people, how, what words they use, how they treat people, whether they medicalize them or make them feel human. We work on programs that also humanize people. So we're always looking for that emotional quotient to somebody who's trying to, develop the next big cure for diabetes or whatever their thing is, they have to be emotionally intelligent. They have to be compassionate in their design, to evoke a sense of, I see you, you matter, and I care. And that, like, the first time I met you, the thing that I'll never forget is just how much you went off about how we need to care about people and how we need to connect to each other. And like, you teared up, and I was like, here's a famous neurosurgeon tearing up in front of me. And I'd never, ever forget, like, your heart is just right here, And I was like, wow, like, that is a gift to the world, to have somebody in your role to do that, to never lose track of that. Well,
that's sweet of you. It's funny. I'll tell you a story. Like, my wife makes fun of me because I tear up at Lassie. So.
Lassie's sad. Lassie's sad.
What can I tell you? But I'll plug my own book while I'm here.
Yes,
if you read my book,
it's a great book. Fantastic.
But well, thank you. But I give an example in there, and it's interesting because on the one hand, we were talking about how we don't want medicine to become transactional. I mean, that's absolutely the most horrible thing, and I've certainly seen that. The problem is, in the business that I do, you have to objectify people. And in fact, in my own book there, I tell a story about an opera singer who, she had a large aneurysm, and the thing she loved most was singing. And she came to me because she had been worked up for headache and had this aneurysm, which had not ruptured. And it was fairly significant size. And I saw her, and she clearly needed to have surgery. And I said, though, you need to see a few other people because I want you to get some other opinions. But in the course of this, I became friends with her, and she shared her music with me, et cetera, et cetera. And she ultimately came back to me and said, I want you to operate on me. And so in the middle of this surgery where I have this aneurysm exposed, and thank goodness we did operate when we did, it was about to rupture. I mean, it was so thin, the wall of this aneurysm, that you could see the blood swirling in it under the microscope, which means it's going to rupture soon. So as I had the clip in my hand to put on to separate the aneurysm from her blood flow near her speech area, my hand started shaking because I was thinking of her. Mm-hmm. And what would happen if I messed up or if something went bad here. And it was so bad that I had to go back and sit down for about 15 or 20 minutes and actually objectify her again to put this into purely a mechanical exercise with no connection at all to her humanity. And I was able to do that, and she did wonderful, and it all worked out fine. But you do have to be able to do that sometimes. But it is really true that you can't separate yourself from the humanity of the patients we take care of. It's interesting. One of the things I've noticed, and I'd be interested in your opinion, mm-hmm. in healthcare, if you look at in other parts of the world, especially in Buddhist countries and in Asian countries, death is part of living. It's mm-hmm, just mm-hmm. a cycle. In the West, it's separated. Yeah.
Yeah, it's isolating and the worst possible outcome, right? Especially in training. I want to offer another dimension to what you just said, which is that, when I have, one time I was driving down Highway 84 towards the west, and I'm half Native American, so I have a very specific training about animals and their relation to us. And I hit a deer. A deer just bound out and kind of whirly-birded over into the ditch over there. And of course, she was struggling to get up. She was kind of like, she was very, very injured. And I stopped the car, and, I started crying at first. And then I went to my trunk because I didn't have anything in the car. And I had this bow drill that's used to make fire, but it had a cord on it. And I went over to her, and I just said a prayer to her, like, I'm very sorry, but I'm going to stop your suffering now. And I wrapped it around her neck, and I choked her. And she was scared, but she also felt like she relaxed, into that moment, maybe because, she was having trouble breathing too. But I do believe that we can communicate and stay with instead of distancing ourselves from if we don't refer back to ourselves. It's when we get nervous about our role or how am I doing or some sort of rumination in the brain that causes us to get too invested in it. But the only other model we know and the only other mindset we know is to completely distance ourselves. So there's almost this kind of, spaciousness, I'll say, of a moment of intensity like that. And of course, I haven't dealt with the level of intensity that you have, so I want to honor that I don't know what you experience. But for me, in those moments of intensity, I've found this kind of mind state where I'm completely present. But if I start to think how this is going to affect me, or am I going to feel sad, or, moving off that present moment at all, even in the slightest bit, then I start to suffer, or I start to get nervous, or I start to get sad, or I start to have all these other side effects.
Well, it's interesting because in some ways you did separate yourself from the suffering of the animal. You acknowledged the suffering of the animal, but you had to alleviate the suffering of the animal, right? Mm-hmm, so you were completely focused on that. And that's not to deny I won't say the humanity of the animal, although sometimes I think animals have sometimes better emotion than some humans. But you were, as you were saying, you were honoring the life of that animal and doing what you had to do for that animal.
Right.
And in some ways, I think it was the same thing with this patient.
Right.
Instead of getting emotionally engaged with the fact that you hit the animal and
right.
caused the animal's ultimate death,
right.
or my having to deal with the situation and realizing the possibilities of that.
Yeah, so I think with the death question, we're so focused on what we're going to miss and what we're going to lack and what we're going to lose that we can't be with death. We can't embrace it and befriend it, and go through the process of it. And then deal with the ramifications and the grief of that loss later on, where that person's not there or that animal's not there in your life, and really feel the vacuum that we feel and go through that grief process of the vacuum.
Well, it's interesting you say that because in, Western medicine, and I see this very frequently, is when a patient is terminal, for whatever reason, what happens to the doctor? He disappears.
They avoid it.
Because it's a reminder of their own failure. And instead of embracing that, being with the patient, they completely disappear, which is a horrible thing because now frankly, in my view, they've abandoned their obligation to the patient and to the patient's family.
Right.
And I gave a talk recently at a TEDx in Sacramento, and I said, for the last quarter century as a neurosurgeon and physician, my goal has been to prevent death, but the greatest lessons I've learned as a human being actually are being with people who are dying who have truly lived. And then I added with that the last decade, what I have as a neuroscientist, if you will, is to try to understand what stops people from truly living. And I think that's really, and it's some of these issues we're talking about, beating yourself up, trying to figure out who you are and how to help yourself and sort of this struggle we call life, and understanding that you need to be gentle with yourself, and the fact that you haven't accomplished either all that you want or sometimes you've taken a step backwards doesn't mean you're a bad person at all. And I think that's really...
Yeah.
So we're sort of heading down this path of, I'm going to start crying soon.
I'm surprised I haven't. I came prepared. I was like, I'm going to cry and I'm going to cry. I care about this topic a lot.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for honoring me in your book. I appreciate you mentioning me.
Love your work
in there. One of the things I want to talk about too is wearables.
Yeah.
So tell me about some of those things.
So from death to wearables. That's a big stretch. You guys going to come along with that?
Yeah,
okay.
I wanted us to come back.
Yes,
and
exactly.
then we'll head back there.
Lighter fare.
I want this to be a roller coaster for you.
This is like the cleansing of the palate in between courses. So wearables. What do you want to know? We've
what do you think
them a
some
lot.
of the most interesting stuff is? Where do you see that field going? I mean, I was just looking at an article recently about, I guess it's sort of like tape, right? That it lasts for 24, 72 hours, and it can measure certain parameters.
Skin conductance. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's ultimately the best thing are passive uses, where you don't have to plug them back in at night or put them back on in the morning and that kind of thing. So, it depends on the use case. But, where we're at right now is they're kind of toys and they're kind of, birthday gifts that you get tired of. That's what I would qualify it as. And where they need to go is something that is a feedback loop where we can kind of say, oh, am I on normal or am I off normal? Because we all drift. There was this point where somebody said, oh, your metabolism slows down. I said, yeah, but I'm still, I don't sprint to my car anymore. I used to do that when I was, yay high. So there's definitely a drop in the amount of activity I just do being alive, And so, how can we catch ourselves from that sort of subconscious, drifting in a direction and not ruddering back? I think that's a good way to do it. But in order to earn their spot in that, this is where the emotional intelligence design comes in. Because right now, without any intervention, people go, oh, I beat my time yesterday. And then there comes a day where you're like, I didn't beat my time yesterday. And then I, again, didn't beat my time. And then it levels off. And then you're like, oh, that sucks. Like, I'm not making any more progress. And then you start to decline almost out of rebellion or disgust with yourself. And so you break up with the experience. And there's no message to say, no, just keep, like, you're on cruise right now. And all you're looking for now is anything where you're drifting off course because you've set a baseline. That's a very good baseline. And this isn't about performance anymore. It's about, maintaining and seeing if there's a way to, find other patterns. Do you exercise more in the summer versus in the winter? I think the other thing, I just went to the Consumer Technology Association Health and Fitness meeting, and one of the panelists at one of the talks kind of, knocked my block with the idea that these aren't fitness trackers, they're steps counters right now. And so we have to get better at creating an experience of what we should focus on in our fitness. For example, not always looking for better performance, but looking for consistency of measurement and being aware of how active I am. And then if that starts to, let's say something happens, I move, I change jobs, and then seeing where that dips and then being able to recover, kind of like that relapse design that we talked about earlier. So I think that's ultimately the best and highest use of those, is kind of like an unconscious mind is never going to track accurately, because we know a lot about our memories and they're remodeled all the time and they're totally inaccurate. We're totally biased. Our brains are totally biased. So if we can have something that's more of a peripheral brain that says, here's the real deal, and we can have a way to look upon it without cringing, then they'll make their way into our trusted sort of inner sanctum, if you will.
What do you think about any of you guys, what is it? Is it Star Trek fans? The cyborg? Is that what they?
Which generation of Star Trek are you?
The Borg.
The Borg.
Yes. Do you think at some point, or I guess for those individuals who are a bit older, and I'm probably one of those, it was the $6 Million Man. Remember that?
The wrist? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then it was was it the $9 Million Woman or something? Oh, that's Trump's wife. No.
Oh gosh.
I should have said that. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Trump. Please forgive me. But Do you think that that's really the future? Or, we hear about the transhumanism movement, right, or Ray Kurzweil, the singularity. Mm-hmm. Do you think we're headed in that direction?
The rate of change of something like that to us is regulated by the self-image, both individually and collectively. So there's this idea of social norms. Years ago, it would have been rude to sit there and look at something and not talk to the person in front of you. And now, is that normal? For a lot of people, it's normal. And some people are still in the camp of like, that's rude. And then there's people like me who are like, that's rude at the table. Like, you can't do that at the table. So, we're trying to all find our way. But, basically as the migration, because we're all very mirror neuron-y, we look off each other, we signal off each other of like, is this okay? Is that okay? We can see you all. And so you're holding yourselves in a certain position, that's socially normed, and nobody's back there doing jumping jacks, even though that's probably the best thing for your health during this talk. Right?
With headphones on.
Yeah, with headphones, just working out over there. So we hold each other in check, right? And so just like the cyborg thing, I'm not just like Google Glass. That's kind of the closest we came, kind of a misfire, right? Where, cause somebody came in, they had like a cyborg thing, nobody else had it. It doesn't matter how expensive it is and how, high end it's supposed to be. It just looked weird because you're looking up and, I think SNL had a skit where he's like looking up and, doing all these weird things. It broke too many social norms all at once. There was no evolutionary, iteration, to that behavior. And so we have this idea of like behaviors found in nature. Anything new has to kind of ride on the mental model of something we already know. Everything on YouTube, the stop, play, pause, that all came from the VCRs and the Sony Walkmans and that kind of thing. So there has to be progenitors and successors to every sort of human behavior. And we migrate like that. That's how it happens.
And again, it's the iterative process, right?
Right, exactly.
Speaking of that, let's say we do overcome our ability to be our worst enemies and are able to actually maximize our behavior change. So, and let's say that we go on with artificial intelligence and maybe even extend to the Borg, if you will. So what happens if there was no more suffering? I know you're going to say you'd be enlightened, right? And the reason I say that, have any of you seen WALL-E? You have this group of people who everything is taken care of for them. They don't have to do anything. There's plenty of food, there's plenty of resources, and they just all lay around and they really don't do anything. In terms of a meaningful life, does there have to be some degree of suffering or at least connection to individuals to care and nurture them, or be cared and nurtured yourself that gives life meaning? And to need caring and nurturing, generally you have to have a need, right?
Right. I think that, it's one of the predominant neural networks of animals to have nurturing, as part of how we survive and how we feel connected. It's that whole oxytocin chain. So I do think that we do need that. I don't know in terms of suffering. That seems to be more like our need for contrast. In the extreme, there's people who, if things are too calm or too okay, they start to stir the pot, right? So they need a little action, it's too calm, it's too peaceful, and they need that contrast in order to motivate themselves or create drama or things to fix or that kind of stuff. So I do think that there's that way in which we learn things through patterns, and that we need contrast patterns in order to learn. It's kind of cyclical. And of course, the Enlightenment, reference, as I understand it, because I'm nowhere near Enlightenment, is that you kind of step off that conveyor belt, some way or the other. There's no more need for that. But then you become, as in Mathieu, you can respond or recognize it. And you can feel compelled to contribute or serve, to help alleviate it. I feel that if there was no more suffering, we would have arrived there by total, skillful action and the ability to respond to one another. But even in the Wally example, that's physical suffering has been alleviated. But what about emotional suffering? What about meaning suffering, the lack of meaning, as you're alluding to at the end of that sentence? Those kinds of forms of suffering haven't been quantified, but we have just as much of a need for those things.
Well, we know that when individuals don't have that type of support or connection, there's immense suffering, right?
Right,
and
exactly.
And then that extends to all sorts of other health problems. What incredible insight was I going to say here? God, it was right on the tip of my mind until you said that.
I've noticed that when I don't have something and I chase after it, it like hides underneath the furniture. But if I relax and I just kind of sit there, just relax. Yeah, exactly. We're all co-creating this experience.
Yes, there was something incredibly impactful here, but alas, I've lost it. Well, maybe what we can do is open the audience to us to questions from the audience. There are some microphones, or does somebody have there are microphones on either side. Does anybody have any questions? You don't want to get up, do you? You can tell it to me. I'll repeat it if you want.
So the question is, I've done a little bit of work here working with undergraduates at Stanford, and the students that are here are so amazing. And I think when they come in, they feel pretty amazing. But while they're here, they're surrounded by other amazing people and start to not feel so amazing anymore, to the point where I think it does affect their mental health.
Yep.
And I wanted to ask you,
Suffering.
What do we do to help them realize that they're still quite wonderful? They have to be surrounded by other wonderful people, but that doesn't make them less wonderful.
Go ahead.
Okay. Then we can switch off. One of the most important design principles that I put in the book is the idea of self-image. So the self-image filters our entire experience. Chose all these clothing that we're wearing and that kind of thing. When somebody's self-image is formed as a young person around better than most people, or able to outperform most people, and that's it's a referential self-image, but it's not an absolute self-image, then you have a mindset of suffering that's just waiting to happen. Because there's always going to be somebody smarter, better, who's not going to, even if you're a top athlete, at some point you'll age out, and then the next person comes in. So, being able to have a flexible mindset around what you place yourself, where you put your self-image in, and appreciating, I am this, I am that, and the unique combination that I am cannot be replicated. That seems to be kind of a safe harbor for, because we all need to have some external sense of where we're at, and contrast and comparison are part of the formation process at this age. But if it's placed on the wrong competition, so to speak, then it is very harmful.
Just to add to that, I think there are a couple issues. One is part of the difficulties we have with some of this generation is we've created this society where everyone's a winner and everyone's not a winner. And as a result, it's created a population of people who feel that they are owed something or do something for just showing up. So that's one problem that a lot of people are dealing with. Specifically in the context of what you're dealing with, the problem is that, unfortunately, parents put burdens on their children and they believe, or at least what the child hears, is my value, which gets love and nurturing from my parent, is if I am in competition and beat people, right? It's not about, am I honest? Do I have good character? Have I tried the best with my abilities? It's all about, I win, you lose. And when that is how your value system is created, that creates another sense of entitlement. I'm better than you because I beat you. It doesn't matter how they beat you. And if you look at some of the scandals here or at Harvard or other very high-powered places where 80% of a class cheats, right? And this has been documented over and over. We have it in the business school. Okay? When the goal is to win at all costs, because when I win, that's my value to people. And then you create a whole culture around that. And then suddenly, as an example, you're no longer that special person. You're no longer that winner. Then you are nothing, right? And so, as an example, let's say, we see a gun here in Silicon Valley here, where these poor children are brought up, and the only value that they see from their parents is, I have to get into Stanford. I have to get into Harvard. If I'm not, I'm a disappointment and mean nothing to my parents. That's the problem. Instead of having true value, whatever you do, whether you're a carpenter, whether you're a trash man, whether you're, a professor at Harvard or Stanford, as long as you are an honest, caring, loving person who is passionate about what they do and cares about other people, that's the most success you can have in life, right? Yes, sir. Or ma'am. I'm sorry. I need to be like the Dalai Lama and get one of those visors because I'm...
It's just glaring.
Yes.
How do I translate the research into the business model? So, we use neuroscience and behavioral science to change behaviors, to design for those behaviors. So we use a design thinking methodology in combination with science to help make apps better, help make interventions better, help platforms that, people have to use better, more emotionally intelligent, more stress reduction out of the use of technology, human interactions, like all those kinds of things. So, we've created videos and interventions and those kinds of things.
So she was asking who your clients.
Who are our clients? Well, we have a lot of NDAs that we write, so we can't say, but we have the largest companies in the world and their employees, their well-being programs, and we have very large, like the U.S. government and Fortune 300, and also startups that we help and we work with. Also, hospital systems, nonprofits, basically the whole gamut, the whole ecosystem. Yeah.
No, I mean, this is a huge area of interest, and it's one that, and Kyra's been involved with multiple programs that affect hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people. And it's hugely important work. Yes, ma'am.
In the beginning, you made a brief reference to where in the brain compassion and empathy light up. Could you say what those locations are?
It's in my book, I believe, and I don't have that top of mind right now.
But it's in the insula and then other reward centers in the brain.
In the bibliography of my book, there's the reference to the actual studies, so you can see at the end of that chapter.
And there's tons of information.
Yeah.
But, we process this initially in the amygdala, right? Mm-hmm. Where this decides if we're going to engage, and we have this fear or flight mechanism. Mm-hmm. So if we see somebody suffering, it's interesting because you have to decide if you're going to run away, whether you're in danger, or whether you're going to actually respond and engage. And there's a whole pathway where this goes through, actually.
Now SIRS. There's two SIRS.
Yes,
Exactly. So the question is, how do you deal with the fact that so much of this change, it has to be fueled by rational thought, or premeditated thought or design. And I think that's why I chose the metaphor of designing as the sort of verb here, because, it implies that you have to have a designer, somebody who thinks ahead, somebody even in the smallest ways, even having a fast brain algorithm of the if this, then that, if cookies, then throw away, even that, helps the fast brain or compete with the fast brain that's controlling and steering most of the behaviors, as you point out. But I do think that the larger implication is things like mindfulness, is things like, being able to have more slow brain design in one's life is absolutely requisite beyond a certain point. Certainly if your life is completely chaotic, if you don't take any time out for yourself at all, your balance of the amount of brain that you're putting into the fast track autopilot versus that which is controlling and steering is imbalanced tremendously. And so once people realize that, once people know it, they can go, okay, that's why this is happening to me. And I've noticed even that knowledge helps them to prioritize it differently. And they're not prioritizing it like, oh, I just need to get more motivated, or I just need more willpower, or other things that are helpless, dead end kind of ways of thinking. When they say, oh, I've got too much in my fast brain going on. I'm going to pull that over here to the slow brain a little bit. I'm going to take a breath, or I'm going to be more premeditated. Then they're in the seat of power, as I was talking about before. Yeah,
and I think what that does is, as you're talking about, it gives you more control. But I think ultimately you merge these, and one of the things that was commented on earlier is this idea of practice. The practice. And when you get into the pattern of doing something over and over, that's really, where you want to be ultimately.
Right.
But it's this iterative process where you don't try to do it tomorrow. Like if I haven't been to the gym and then I suddenly go to the gym, I start trying to get right back to where I was and turning the machine on at a 9-degree tilt, and then I get thrown off. But you can't do that. You have to, start with the baby steps again and get back there. And that's the hardest thing, because, at least for me, you see yourself where you were, and then you want to be right back there immediately. And unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way. One more question. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. Well, the question is, how do you develop a sense that the practice itself is the game, as opposed to the game is winning and getting here, and now I'm done, and now I'm successful?
Well, I would say that, and this has been said before, success is a journey, not a destination, of course. It's really making individuals understand that it's a journey, it's not a destination, and not be absolutely focused on getting something. And sometimes slowing your entire life down is the best goal, right? Because, if you think about it, as we evolved as a species, look what we've completely distorted, right? We have artificial light that keeps us up far beyond how we were made to live. We have diets which have been so refined, it's nowhere like what we were evolved to eat. And, can we go back? I think it's hard, but I think one of the things is not necessarily promoting our children to have, look, if you don't do this, you're not making it, man. And, I have a 12-year-old, and to be frank with you, and especially from my own personal background where I sort of went through this thing, I have to do this. My wife finally beat the hell out of me enough to say, look, she's a wonderful person. That's the goal here. If he has curiosity, be thankful for that, and just let him do what he does and not put some artificial thing that I want on him. And that was a very hard thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably one of the hardest things as a parent, because what you're doing is transferring to them oftentimes either what you see as your own failures or what you think they need to be to fulfill an aspiration that you had. And that's the challenge, I think. And that's impermanence and letting go, right? Yes, sir. So, I said it was the last question, but I'm going to give you the last question. So your question is, can you speak a little louder?
So how do you practice suffering?
Well, the goal is to alleviate suffering, not practice it. But I think I understand what you're saying in the sense that there's so many other people who potentially are, if you will, quote unquote, suffering much more. You're not suffering that much. So how do you be present for that? Is that how we? Well, the fact of the matter, though, is I'm not sure if that's really true. As an example, I know several people, at least by the scales that we were alluding to, where, they graduated the highest in their class. They've created a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They have everything. These are some of the most miserable, suffering, empty, lost people I have ever met in my entire life. And, to equate that what they are experiencing is different perhaps than somebody starving, yes, I mean, they're probably not going to die from starvation, but they are suffering greatly. And this is one of the things I think even for myself that was really hard, was to look at people who nominally have everything by Western society standards, go, whoa, they don't have any right to complain. They have everything. But the fact of the matter is many of them don't have anything. In my own trajectory of my life, I thought being worth, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars and driving a Ferrari and living in a penthouse and dating all these, I won't say co-eds. I guess they weren't co-eds then. They were the next level above a co-ed, a bimbo. No, but I'm being facetious, of course. But my point is though that, I went through this experience. And theoretically, I had all my friends and all these people going, God, Jim, you have the great life. This is fantastic. You have everything. You can travel here. You can travel there. And I have never been so miserable in my entire life when I had that. Never. I was just horribly unhappy, and I didn't even want to wake up every morning. And in fact, what I was doing was creating a show for all the people who were around me because they thought it was so great. And so I was giving to them and making it look as though it was this great time when in fact it actually wasn't, because I was so empty within myself. But this is a long existential conversation, so we should probably stop now.
Well, do you want me to add?
Yes,
to that?
please
Okay.
add to that.
So one of my favorite pastimes is to talk to strangers and to interview them and to ask them about their experience. And by doing that, I always get Uber drivers is one population that I really love to interview. By doing that, I always get to this leveling, this equanimity that nobody's immune to suffering, that nobody's not suffering. And so, how can I offer a little boost, a little make them feel good kind of feeling, before they leave? Like I challenge myself to help them feel heard, seen, and appreciated, because it's so soothing. Once you hear somebody's suffering and they're able to just really be heard, they relax. They kind of just melt. There was this one Uber driver when I was in San Diego a couple weeks ago. He was so mad. He had road rage, and I was kind of afraid that we were going to wreck. And I asked him about his experience growing up in San Diego, and he said, yeah, it's all changed. It's all, too many people now and all these things. And we really got around to the fact that he wanted to do something different than what his father wanted him to do. And he told me, once I heal people, my dad will see how important what I'm doing. And then we got out of the car, and he handed me my bag, and I just shook his hand. I said, follow your heart. And he just melted. He just, and that's that feeling of you see me, you hear me, you know what I'm doing and why I exist. And this is that oxytocin thing that I was talking about that's so deficient. People are hungry. They're aching for connection and for being seen and heard. And once you give it to them, I love book signings for that reason. We share that moment together, and I'm fed and you're fed, and it's just this vibe, and it's equanimity, at its most beautiful healing form. So that's what I would say, how to look at it.
And I think that's exactly right. And, remember, and I've said this multiple times, and it just reiterates what you said. First of all, many of you who may be followers of Thich Nhat Hanh, he talks about compassionate listening. And that's really critically important. That's what you're doing. Mm-hmm. And it also makes you recognize in the simple act that each of us has the ability to have a positive impact on somebody's life every day. And I think that's really where we need to be.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. I guess we're going to do a book signing. This is a great book. There are very few books that I highlight in different spots, so I would highly recommend. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.